we think of the lone homestead in the Midwest, the lone farmhouse or the cabin in the mountains. They weren't really controlled by too many other forces. But how did you even get to that lone homestead? You had to defeat the Indians first, and that required a huge communal effort. Greetings, friends. I made a few notes for this video, not too many. I'm just going to try and talk mostly off the top of my head here. It's not well thought out enough. You'll find plenty of things you can call me out on and criticize me and say, oh, you didn't bring up this or that. But we need to talk about crony capitalism. This is used as kind of a cope to justify capitalism. And I myself talked about crony capitalism. If you go back a few years ago, I was, doing the whole free market thing in some of my videos, talking about how the real problem is crony capitalism, where the big corporations, they get favors from the government, they get tax breaks, and that enables them to make more money and more business, and therefore they drown out all the small businesses, small competitors. It leads to more monopolies or something approaching a monopoly, duopolies, or what do they call it? Like oligopolies or whatever they call it, where there's like a small number of massive corporations dominating the market and controlling our lives. And that's true. That's absolutely true. I don't like these big corporations, of course. The problem is that when we say, oh, the problem is crony capitalism, we're really missing the mark, and we're sort of, it's a weak cope, because capitalism itself is a spiritually empty system. It cannot make your civilization work. It cannot make your society healthy. It will only lead to chaos. And I should say, of course, I'm no socialist. Obviously, I am kind of a capitalist myself from what I've done overseas, but the thing is, the capitalist socialist divide is kind of a false dichotomy, because if you go back to the Cold War, there was the supposedly free market capitalist United States versus the socialist Soviet Union. But this is not what it was really about, because both sides were controlled by the global elites. China becoming the manufacturer of the world, do you think that's a coincidence? I don't think it's a coincidence. Again, maybe it was. I didn't do my homework on that particular point, but I'm pretty sure that China didn't become the manufacturer of the world just through free market competition. I think it was agreed that was the way it was going to be. So much for your free market capitalism there. If you try to have the government control everything, then it's all going to fall apart in the end. And that's true. You need to have some freedom. But it's also true that if you just focus on capitalism, what's going to happen is you're going to lead to a situation where, in a free competition, in a supposedly free market, even though there's never really been any free market in the world ever in history, but maybe there's been better approximations of one. And I've read Adam Smith. I've read The Whole Wealth of Nations. It's a big book, lots of interesting ideas in it. But that sort of free market competition, inevitably some people start to win out, some people start to get bigger. So therefore there is some impetus for antitrust behavior to limit these big corporations from dominating the market. But essentially, if you had a pure capitalist system, it would just lead to like a pure socialist system eventually over time, because it's like sort of Darwinian survival of the fittest. Eventually there's going to be one predator which knocks out all the other ones. So again, that's not a perfect analogy, So yeah, this whole socialism capitalism dichotomy is flawed. And when did capitalism actually exist? Like it never really. What, when, in the 18th century America, in the 19th century America? I mean, yeah, there was more freedom back then, but like people were still more communal. People were really rooted in their communities. They had much more social norms. So in like it's socially, was there that individualism? I mean, kind of, but I mean maybe there was more economic individualism, but culturally, socially, people were much more rooted in their traditions, and that's a form of control on how you're going to live your life, the sorts of things you're going to do as well. I do think there was a chaotic nature to the expansion of the United States. And it comes down to spiritual values. Even a lot of it comes out of the Protestant Reformation, which had some positive qualities to it, but which was overall a rebellion against order, a rebellion against the established institutions of the Catholic Church. I'm not. Obviously, the Catholic Church isn't perfect, and maybe there did need to be a reform. But they should have gone. You see, I don't want to get off, into too much of that stuff. But I'm just saying you need the spiritual underpinning. Socialism, capitalism, this dichotomy, it doesn't have any spiritual, theological underpinning. And I'm not saying, the average person has to understand theology, but you need these principles. Maybe it's not like intellectual principles, but you need that founding culture. To inform the society, to inform how we live our lives. Otherwise, you're just going to get pretty much the same sort of chaotic situation where you're dominated by a few elites. We always have been dominated by the elites to some extent or another. But capitalism is materialistic. Maybe socialism was too. Maybe it was too, to an extent. But then that's the point. So the free market has never really existed. And yeah, in the 18th and 19th century, what were they called? The indentured laborers coming over here, and then the African slaves coming over here. The small number of people with money buying up the land very early on. The Puritans in the Northeast with their very communal style of living. I guess that started to break apart after a few generations. The descendants of the Puritans, they really did go off and start doing their individualistic thing, but they couldn't agree with one another. There were different religious sects. They were constantly competing with one another. We think of the lone homestead in the Midwest, the lone farmhouse, or the cabin in the mountains. But particularly like this one house out there, probably a farming family, but maybe they're doing something else, and they sort of represent this individualistic, purely capitalistic. Well, not so much if it's farming, right? Because they were very communal people. They liked lots of socialism. Certainly in the end of the 19th century, early 20th century, but the idea, I'm just saying that was this popular ideal, and to an extent, yeah, it was individualistic. They weren't really controlled by too many other forces. But how did you even get to that lone homestead? You had to defeat the Indians first, and that required a huge communal effort. You might call that socialistic effort of you needed the army to come in there. So you needed a lot of organization. And so it didn't just pop out of nowhere. It popped out of, this vast cooperation. And how do you have that vast cooperation? By having a coherent culture, tradition, and order, right? Order is the big idea. That's sort of one of the main points I'm stressing is order. You needed that order to even get to the point where you could have that lone homestead and not have to worry about some savages coming and scalping you or burning down your house and killing your family, right? So even that nice capitalistic example came out of not necessarily a socialism. I don't like to use that word. That's kind of, a more modern term. So is capitalism. They're both kind of modern terms, but it came out of, order, tradition, communal effort. The lone homestead is kind of abnormal in history. If you went back to Europe, most people, like, there were no lone homesteads as far as I'm aware. People lived in villages mostly for protection. And I will say that there was like there is a nomadic, somewhat of a nomadic, and you might say individualistic character to Europeans. I mean, you might find it in some other cultures too, but they would historically they're more pastoralists with their animals, so the kings couldn't control them because they could just leave. They could just take their animals and leave. I mean, you find this in some other parts of the world too. Like in Africa, there's lots of pastoralists too. Also more chaotic in Africa. It's hard for the state to control everything. But again, I'm not saying one or the other. But the whole crony capitalism thing, it's like, yes, of course we see that the corporations have undue influence and they're just getting more and more powerful. And we're probably going to talk about this in another video about how they're going to, eat up all the market share, especially since the lockdowns, which I think part of the reason that they had the lockdowns, so they could eat up more of the small businesses. But we're missing the point. It's not just about one or the other. It's that there has to be some sort of underpinning. There has to be some sort of foundation that grounds you, and you can't find that in capitalism. And because capitalism never really existed. I mean, how do you even define it? It could be defined in so many different ways. And also, I would make the point that, like the whole idea that conservatives and right-wing people are like pro-free market and pro-capitalism, I mean, I'm not so sure about that, because that's kind of a product of the Ronald Reagan era in the 80s. A certain ethnic group who's very influential in the entire world, they don't just dominate the left, they also dominate the right. And they created this whole free market idea. Milton Friedman would be a good example of this. And so they were already playing both sides. It's a useful idea because if you focus on individualism and getting ahead and profit, then you can start to dismantle the culture, start to dismantle the order that has been sustaining the culture in the first place. It's about power. So conservatives being a free market, no, that's sort of a modern thing. I mean, if you go back in time, late 19th century, early 20th century, the Democrats were around back then, of course, and there were the Republicans by the early 20th century, but it was the Democrats actually favored, they were more of the free market party, because Peter Schiff, if you know Peter Schiff, he said he would have voted for the Democrats if it was like the early 20th century, because they were like lower tariffs and all that stuff. And it was the Republicans, they were the ones who wanted protectionism. They wanted high tariffs. And this isn't just for a short time. This was like a continuous thing for many years. It didn't change until after World War II, I guess. That's sort of an adjacent point. It's not really relevant to this video, but is that it's not so much about profit for these big corporations. It's about power. It's about controlling what you think, how you live your life. That's why they push global homo. It's not profitable for them. It's not. But they still do it, and they don't care, because it's not, at least at that level, it's no longer about making money. And so that throws the whole capitalism idea out of, no longer makes sense, because isn't capitalism about making money? But then these big corporations, they stop caring about making money, because either they have enough, or they have enough power, they have enough connections. Hasta luego, amigos.